In the shadowed corners of the male psyche lies a force so powerful it can transform rational men into devoted followers, inspire obsessive creativity, and drive the deepest longings of the human heart. Carl Jung called this force the Anima, the feminine aspect within every man's unconscious mind. What if one of the most influential artists of our time has become the living embodiment of this ancient archetype? What if Taylor Swift's unprecedented cultural impact isn't just about music, but about something far more profound? The activation of humanity's deepest psychological patterns? This is the story of how a country girl from Pennsylvania became the modern world's most powerful Anima projection, and why understanding this connection might be the key to understanding ourselves. Through 5 interconnected chapters, we'll journey into the depths of Jungian psychology, explore the hidden mechanisms of desire and idealization, and discover why millions of people, particularly men, find themselves inexplicably drawn to Taylor Swift's narrative universe. But this isn't just about celebrity worship or pop culture analysis. This is about the shadow work required to recognize our projections, the individuation process that leads to psychological wholeness, and the profound healing that comes from understanding the archetypal forces that shape our relationships, creativity, and sense of meaning. By the end of this exploration, you'll never see Taylor Swift, or your own inner world, the same way again. Chapter 1. The Anima Awakens. The conference room at Spotify headquarters buzzed with nervous energy as executives gathered around the massive screen displaying streaming numbers that defied all logic. Marcus Chen, a 34-year-old data analyst who prided himself on rational thinking, stared at the charts with growing bewilderment. Taylor Swift's latest album had broken every conceivable record, but what puzzled him most wasn't the numbers. It was his own inexplicable reaction to her music. "I don't understand it," Marcus confessed to his colleague Sarah during their lunch break, his voice carrying a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show. "I'm a grown man. I have a PhD in statistics. I should be immune to whatever this is." He gestured helplessly at his phone, where All Too Well, 10-minute version, had been playing on repeat for the past week. "But when I listen to her songs, it's like she's speaking directly to some part of me I didn't even know existed." Sarah, a longtime Swiftie and amateur psychology enthusiast, smiled knowingly. "You're experiencing what Carl Jung would call an anima projection," she explained, pulling up an article on her tablet. The anima is the feminine aspect within a man's unconscious mind. It's not just about attraction. It's about the inner feminine that guides creativity, emotion, and the search for meaning. Marcus felt a chill of recognition. Throughout his adult life, he had been drawn to women who seemed to embody something ineffable, a quality he could never quite name but always recognized. His ex-wife Jennifer had possessed it briefly during their courtship, but it had faded as their relationship became routine. His current girlfriend Amy was wonderful, practical, and supportive, but she didn't ignite that same mysterious spark that made him feel like he was touching something sacred. "But Swift doesn't even know I exist," Marcus protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "How can I be projecting onto someone I've never met?" "That's exactly the point," Sarah replied, her eyes lighting up with the enthusiasm of someone who had found her intellectual passion. The anima isn't about the actual woman. It's about the archetypal feminine that she represents. Jung believed that men carry within them an unconscious image of the ideal woman, shaped by their relationship with their mother, their cultural conditioning, and their deepest psychological needs. As Sarah spoke, Marcus found himself remembering his childhood in suburban Connecticut, where his mother, Patricia, had been the emotional center of their household. She was the one who encouraged his creativity, who listened to his dreams, who made him feel understood in ways his pragmatic father never could. When she died suddenly when Marcus was 16, something inside him had closed off, a door to his emotional life that he had spent years trying to reopen. Swift's music, Sarah continued, taps into what Jung called the collective unconscious, those universal patterns and images that exist in all human psyches. She's become a modern manifestation of the Anima archetype, which is why her influence extends far beyond typical celebrity fandom. Marcus thought about the men in his office who had initially mocked his newfound interest in Taylor Swift, only to quietly admit weeks later that they, too, had found themselves drawn into her musical universe. David, the tough-talking former Marine who ran their security department, had been caught humming "Shake It Off" during a staff meeting. Professor Williams, the elderly economist who consulted for their company, had mentioned in passing that Swift's lyrics reminded him of the poetry his late wife used to read to him. It's like she's activated something dormant in the male psyche, Marcus mused, finally beginning to understand the scope of what he was experiencing. But why her? Why now? Sarah leaned forward, her expression growing more serious. Because we're living in an age of psychological fragmentation. Traditional gender roles are shifting, men are struggling to understand their emotional lives, and there's a hunger for authentic feminine wisdom that goes beyond surface-level attraction. Swift has managed to embody what Jung called the integrated anima. She's vulnerable, yet strong, creative, yet grounded, accessible, yet mysterious. That evening, Marcus sat in his apartment overlooking the Hudson River, Taylor Swift's folklore album playing softly in the background. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his emotional life. The grief over his mother's death, the loneliness that had driven him through a series of unsatisfying relationships, the creative dreams he had abandoned in favor of financial security. As Ronan began to play, Swift's heartbreaking tribute to a young boy who died of cancer, Marcus felt tears streaming down his face. But these weren't tears of sadness alone. They were tears of recognition. In Swift's ability to transform personal pain into universal art, he saw a reflection of his own untapped potential for emotional depth and creative expression. This is what Jung meant by the anima as a bridge to the unconscious, he whispered to himself, finally understanding that his attraction to Taylor Swift wasn't about romantic fantasy. It was about psychological integration. She represented the parts of himself he had learned to suppress: his sensitivity, his creativity, his capacity for deep emotional connection. The anima had awakened, and Marcus realized that his journey toward wholeness was just beginning. Chapter 2: The Projection Trap. 3 months after his initial awakening to the Anima archetype, Marcus found himself standing in line at MetLife Stadium, surrounded by thousands of other Taylor Swift fans preparing for the Eras Tour. The demographic diversity struck him immediately: teenage girls with their mothers, college students, middle-aged women, and surprisingly, a significant number of men who looked just as bewildered as he felt about their presence there. Jake Morrison, a 28-year-old construction worker from Queens, stood directly behind Marcus in line. His calloused hands clutched a sign that read, "Taylor, you saved my life," and his eyes held the fervent intensity of someone who had found religion. "I know this sounds crazy," Jake said, apparently needing to share his story with someone. "But her music got me through the darkest period of my life. When my dad died last year, I couldn't function. Couldn't work, couldn't sleep, couldn't feel anything. Then I heard, 'Soon you'll get better.' And it was like she understood exactly what I was going through." Marcus nodded, recognizing the familiar pattern. Jake was experiencing what Jung called anima projection, the unconscious process by which men project their inner feminine onto external women, seeking in them the qualities they cannot access within themselves. But as Marcus had learned through his recent deep dive into Jungian psychology, this projection could become a trap if left unexamined. Have you ever considered that what you're responding to in Taylor isn't really about her as a person? Marcus asked gently, drawing on the insights he had gained from his sessions with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a Jungian analyst he had started seeing. Jung believed that when we project our anima onto someone, we're actually seeking to connect with disowned parts of ourselves. Jake's expression shifted from confusion to defensiveness. "You're saying my feelings aren't real? That I'm just making this up?" "Not at all," Marcus replied, remembering his own initial resistance to this concept. "The feelings are absolutely real, but Jung would say that the intensity of your connection to Taylor suggests she's carrying something for you, some aspect of your own psyche that you haven't fully integrated." As they moved closer to the stadium entrance, Marcus observed the crowd with new eyes. He saw middle-aged men clutching concert merchandise with the same intensity their teenage daughters might show, their faces lit with an almost religious fervor. He noticed young fathers who had clearly been dragged to the concert by their families, but were now singing along to every word. Their usual masculine composure dissolved in the face of Swift's archetypal power. Dr. Rodriguez had explained to Marcus that the anima projection often intensified during periods of psychological crisis or transition. When men feel disconnected from their emotional lives, from their creativity, or from their sense of meaning, she had said during their last session, they unconsciously seek these qualities in external women. Taylor Swift has become a cultural repository for these projections because she embodies what Jung called the eternal feminine, the source of inspiration, emotional wisdom, and creative power. Inside the stadium, as the lights dimmed and Swift took the stage, Marcus witnessed something extraordinary. The collective energy of 50,000 people seemed to shift into something primal and archetypal. Grown men wept openly during Ronin, screamed with abandon during "We Are Never Getting Back Together," and held their phones aloft like modern prayer candles during All Too Well. But Marcus also noticed something troubling. Tommy Chen, no relation, a 45-year-old accountant sitting in the row ahead, was filming every moment of the concert with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. His wife Linda sat beside him, looking increasingly uncomfortable as Tommy's attention remained fixed on the stage with an almost religious devotion. During the intermission, Marcus overheard Tommy explaining to his friend Mike how he had spent thousands of dollars following the Eras tour to multiple cities. "My wife thinks I'm crazy." Tommy laughed, but there was a hollow quality to his laughter. "She doesn't understand that Taylor gets me in a way that no one else does. When I listen to her music, I feel like I'm finally connecting with the person I was meant to be." Marcus felt a chill of recognition. Tommy was trapped in what Jung called the negative aspect of anima projection, the tendency to idealize external women while remaining disconnected from one's own inner feminine qualities. 7. Instead of using his attraction to Swift as a bridge to his own emotional and creative depths, Tommy was using it as an escape from the difficult work of psychological integration. The danger, Dr. Rodriguez had warned Marcus, is when the projection becomes a substitute for genuine self-development. Instead of recognizing that Taylor Swift represents qualities you need to develop within yourself, creativity, emotional authenticity, the courage to be vulnerable, you can become addicted to the projection itself. As the second half of the concert began, Marcus made a conscious effort to shift his attention inward. Instead of losing himself in the spectacle of Swift's performance, he used it as a mirror for his own psychological process. When she sang The Archer, a song about self-examination and the fear of being truly seen, Marcus felt his own defenses beginning to crumble. "I've been the archer, I've been the prey," Swift sang, and Marcus realized that he had been both the hunter and the hunted in his own psychological journey. He had been hunting for the feminine qualities he needed to integrate, but he had also been prey to his own projections, allowing them to distract him from the real work of becoming whole. After the concert, as the crowd dispersed into the New Jersey night, Marcus found himself walking beside Jake, who seemed subdued and contemplative. "That was incredible," Jake said, but his voice carried a note of confusion. But I feel empty now, like I was expecting something that didn't happen. Marcus understood. The projection trap had been revealed in all its complexity. The way it could provide temporary transcendence, while ultimately leaving the projector more disconnected from their authentic self. Jung would say that's the signal to turn inward, Marcus offered. The emptiness you're feeling might be your psyche telling you that it's time to stop looking for salvation outside yourself. As they reached the parking lot, Marcus felt a profound shift in his relationship to Taylor Swift and to his own psychological journey. The Anima projection had served its purpose. It had awakened him to the existence of his own inner feminine. But now the real work was beginning. The slow, difficult process of integrating these qualities into his conscious personality, rather than seeking them in external projections. The trap had been revealed, and the path to freedom lay not in rejecting the anima, but in claiming it as his own. Chapter 3. The Shadow Behind the Spotlight. 6 months into his Jungian analysis, Marcus had developed a more nuanced understanding of his relationship with Taylor Swift and the Anima archetype. But it was during a particularly intense session with Dr. Rodriguez that he encountered the darker aspects of his psychological journey, what Jung called the shadow. I've been thinking about something disturbing, Marcus began, settling into the familiar leather chair in Dr. Rodriguez's office. The more I've studied Swift's cultural impact, the more I've noticed some troubling patterns in how men relate to her. It's not just projection, there's something more sinister happening. Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward, her expression encouraging him to continue. Tell me what you've observed. Marcus pulled out his phone, showing her a series of social media posts he had been collecting. Look at this, he said, scrolling through comments on Swift's Instagram. Men talking about her like she belongs to them. Fans who become enraged when she dates someone new, as if she's betraying them personally. There's this sense of ownership that feels deeply unhealthy. The posts were indeed troubling. Swiftly Mind 47 had written, Taylor needs to stop dating these losers and find a real man who appreciates her. A Taylor My Queen had posted, I've been loyal to Taylor for 15 years. She owes her fans better than this. The comments revealed a dark undercurrent of possessiveness and entitlement that Marcus found deeply unsettling. What you're describing, Dr. Rodriguez explained, is the shadow aspect of anima projection. Jung believed that every archetype has both light and dark manifestations. The positive anima inspires creativity, emotional depth, and psychological growth. But the negative anima can manifest as possessiveness, idealization that borders on dehumanization, and the projection of one's own unresolved psychological issues onto external women. Marcus thought about Derek Williams, a co-worker who had initially bonded with him over their shared appreciation for Swift's music. But Derek's relationship with Swift's artistry had gradually revealed disturbing elements. He had created elaborate fantasies about rescuing her from her various relationships, spent his savings on concert tickets and merchandise while neglecting his own financial responsibilities, and had become increasingly isolated from real-world relationships. Derek told me last week that he's never felt as understood by any woman as he feels understood by Taylor, Marcus said, but he's never actually had a conversation with her. He's relating to a projection of his own creation, not to a real human being. Dr. Rodriguez nodded gravely. This is what Jung called the anima possession, when a man becomes so identified with his anima projection that he loses touch with reality. The woman becomes a screen onto which he projects all his unresolved psychological material, rather than a separate human being with her own agency and complexity. Marcus had been researching this phenomenon and had discovered disturbing patterns in online fan communities. Reddit forums dedicated to Swift often contained discussions that revealed the shadow side of anima projection. Men analyzing her lyrics for hidden messages directed specifically at them, creating elaborate theories about her personal life based on minimal evidence, and expressing rage when her actual choices didn't align with their fantasies. 59. There's something particularly insidious about how Swift's confessional songwriting style feeds into this, Marcus observed. She writes in the first person, often addressing an unnamed you. It's brilliant artistically, but it creates the perfect conditions for projection. Men hear these songs and unconsciously insert themselves into the narrative. Dr. Rodriguez pulled out a well-worn copy of Jung's The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. Jung wrote extensively about this phenomenon, she said, flipping to a marked passage. He observed that when men fail to integrate their own anima, their capacity for emotion, creativity, and relational depth, they become vulnerable to what he called anima fascination. They become obsessed with external women who seem to embody these qualities, but they remain disconnected from developing these qualities within themselves. Marcus felt a chill of recognition. I think I've been guilty of this myself, he admitted. Not to Derek's extent, but I've definitely used my interest in Swift's music as a way to avoid dealing with my own emotional work. It's easier to analyze her lyrics than to examine my own patterns in relationships. The fact that you can recognize this is significant, Dr. Rodriguez replied. Shadow work requires the courage to acknowledge the parts of ourselves we'd rather not see. In your case, you're recognizing how your attraction to Swift has sometimes served as a defense mechanism against genuine intimacy and self-examination. Marcus thought about his relationship with Amy, his girlfriend of 8 months. He had been so focused on his psychological journey with the Anima archetype that he had neglected to bring the same level of attention and curiosity to his actual relationship with a real woman. Amy had mentioned feeling like she was competing with his Taylor Swift obsession, and Marcus had dismissed her concerns as jealousy, but now he wondered if she had been picking up on something more troubling. There's another shadow aspect I've been noticing, Marcus continued. The way Swift's wealth and privilege get overlooked in these projections. Men project their anima onto her, but they're often projecting onto an idealized version that ignores the reality of her position as one of the most powerful people in the entertainment industry. Dr. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. Explain what you mean. Swift is a billionaire who owns multiple properties, has enormous cultural influence, and operates within systems of power that most of her fans will never access, Marcus said. But the anima projection often infantilizes her, treating her as if she's still the vulnerable teenager from her early albums. It's a form of psychological colonization, taking a complex, powerful woman and reducing her to a repository for male fantasies. This realization had been particularly uncomfortable for Marcus. He had noticed how his own fantasies about Swift often involved scenarios where he could understand or protect her in ways that her actual romantic partners supposedly couldn't. These fantasies revealed his own unconscious misogyny, the assumption that he could somehow know what was best for a woman he had never met, based entirely on his projections. The shadow work here, Dr. Rodriguez explained, involves recognizing how your anima projections might be serving your ego rather than your genuine psychological development. True integration of the anima requires developing these feminine qualities within yourself, not seeking them in external women, and certainly not trying to control or possess the women onto whom you project. As their session drew to a close, Marcus felt the weight of this shadow work settling over him. The journey toward psychological wholeness was proving to be far more complex and challenging than he had initially imagined. It wasn't enough to simply recognize his anima projections. He had to examine the ways these projections might be harming both himself and the women in his life. The goal, Dr. Rodriguez said as Marcus prepared to leave, isn't to eliminate your appreciation for Taylor Swift's artistry or to shame yourself for the projections you've experienced. The goal is to use this awareness as a doorway to deeper self-knowledge and more authentic relationships. Walking home through the bustling streets of Manhattan, Marcus felt the familiar pull of Swift's music on his headphones. But now, he listened with different ears, not seeking escape or projection, but using the music as a mirror for his own psychological process. The shadow had been revealed, and the real work of integration was just beginning. Chapter 4. The Individuation Journey. A year into his Jungian analysis, Marcus found himself in an unexpected place. Sitting across from Amy in a couples therapy session, finally ready to examine how his psychological journey had affected their relationship. The small office of Dr. Michael Thompson, a therapist who specialized in Jungian approaches to relationships, felt like a crucible where all of Marcus's theoretical understanding would be tested against the reality of intimate human connection. "I feel like I've been dating a ghost," Amy said, her voice carrying a year's worth of accumulated frustration. Ever since Marcus started this whole Taylor Swift thing, he's been more interested in analyzing his inner feminine than in actually relating to me, a real woman sitting right in front of him. Marcus felt the familiar defensive response rising in his chest, but Dr. Thompson's steady gaze encouraged him to pause and listen more deeply. Amy continued, "I've watched him spend hours analyzing song lyrics, reading Jung, going to therapy sessions about his Anima projection. Meanwhile, I'm trying to build a real relationship with someone who seems more fascinated by his psychological theories than by the actual woman he's supposed to love." Amy's feedback is pointing to something crucial in the individuation process, Dr. Thompson observed. Jung believed that true psychological development requires not just understanding archetypal patterns, but integrating them into lived relationships. Marcus, how do you respond to what Amy is sharing? Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of a year's worth of psychological work converging in this moment. I think I've been using my interest in Jungian psychology as another form of avoidance," he admitted. "It's been easier to analyze the Anima archetype than to actually develop the qualities I've been projecting onto Taylor Swift." This admission had been building for months. Marcus had begun to notice that his psychological insights weren't translating into behavioral changes. He could eloquently discuss the integration of the feminine principle, but he still struggled to express vulnerability in his relationship with Amy. He could analyze Swift's lyrics for their archetypal significance, but he had difficulty accessing his own emotional depths in real-time conversations with his girlfriend. "Tell me about a specific example, Doctor?" Thompson prompted. Amy leaned forward. "Last month, I was going through a difficult time at work. I was feeling overwhelmed, uncertain about my career direction, and I needed emotional support. Instead of just listening and being present with me, Marcus started analyzing my situation through a Jungian lens. He talked about my shadow work and my individuation process, when all I needed was for him to hold me and tell me everything would be okay." Marcus felt a flush of shame. "I thought I was being helpful," he said quietly. "I thought applying psychological insights would be more valuable than just being there." "This is a common trap in the individuation journey," Dr. Thompson explained. Jung called it psychological inflation, when someone becomes so identified with their psychological insights that they lose touch with simple human connection. The goal of individuation isn't to become a walking psychology textbook, but to become more fully human. Over the following weeks, Marcus began to understand that his year-long journey with the Anima archetype had been both necessary and insufficient. The psychological awakening had been real. He had indeed discovered parts of himself that had been dormant since his mother's death. But he had been treating this discovery as an intellectual exercise rather than as a call to embodied transformation. "The Anima isn't just about understanding feminine qualities," Dr. Rodriguez explained during one of their sessions. "It's about integrating them into your personality structure. That means developing your capacity for emotional receptivity, creative expression, and intuitive understanding, not just in theory, but in your daily interactions with the world." Marcus began to see how his fascination with Taylor Swift had served as a transitional object in his psychological development, a bridge between his disconnected masculine persona and his disowned feminine qualities. But like any transitional object, it was meant to be eventually outgrown, not clung to indefinitely. The real work of integration began when Marcus started applying his insights to his relationship with Amy. Instead of analyzing her experiences through psychological frameworks, he began practicing what Jung called active imagination, allowing himself to feel into her emotional reality without immediately trying to understand or fix it. When Amy talks about her work stress, Marcus shared with Dr. Rodriguez, "I'm learning to notice my impulse to offer solutions or psychological interpretations. Instead, I'm trying to just receive her experience, to let it affect me emotionally without immediately moving into my head." This shift was more challenging than Marcus had anticipated. His intellectual understanding of the anima had been a form of control, a way of managing his relationship to the feminine without actually surrendering to it. True integration required what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, maintaining both his masculine capacity for analysis and his emerging feminine capacity for emotional receptivity. The breakthrough came during a quiet evening in Marcus and Amy's apartment. Amy had been sharing her concerns about her aging parents, and Marcus felt his usual impulse to offer advice or psychological insights. But instead, he simply moved closer to her on the couch and placed his hand on her back, allowing himself to feel the weight of her worry without trying to transform it into something more manageable. "That's exactly what I needed," Amy said softly, leaning into his presence. "Not solutions or analysis, just you being with me in this." Marcus felt something shift inside him. A recognition that the anima integration he had been seeking wasn't about understanding feminine qualities, but about embodying them. The capacity for emotional presence, for creative receptivity, for intuitive connection. These weren't concepts to be analyzed, but ways of being to be lived. "I think I understand now why I was so drawn to Taylor Swift's music," Marcus told Amy later that evening. "She represents something I needed to develop in myself, the ability to feel deeply, to express vulnerability, to find meaning in emotional experience. But I was trying to get those qualities through projection instead of through actual development." Amy smiled, and Marcus saw something in her expression that he had been missing for months, a recognition of him as a real person rather than a collection of psychological theories. "I've been waiting for you to come back to Earth," she said. "The psychological work was important, but I needed you to bring it into our actual relationship." As Marcus reflected on his individuation journey, he realized that Taylor Swift had served her archetypal function perfectly. She had awakened him to the existence of his own inner feminine, had shown him qualities he needed to develop, and had provided a safe container for exploring these aspects of himself. But the real work, the integration of these qualities into his conscious personality and his lived relationships, could only happen through the patient, daily practice of being more fully human. The anima had called him home to himself, and now the real journey was beginning. Chapter 5. The Integrated Self. 2 years after his initial encounter with the anima archetype through Taylor Swift's music, Marcus stood in the same Spotify conference room where his journey had begun. But everything had changed. The quarterly presentation he was about to give would incorporate not just data analysis, but insights about the psychological patterns underlying music consumption, a synthesis of his analytical skills and his newly integrated emotional intelligence. Sarah, his colleague, who had first introduced him to Jungian concepts, noticed the transformation immediately. "You seem different," she observed as they prepared for the meeting. "More present, like you're actually inhabiting your own life instead of analyzing it from the outside." Marcus smiled, recognizing the truth in her observation. The past 2 years had been a journey of psychological integration, learning to embody the insights he had gained rather than simply understanding them intellectually. His relationship with Amy had deepened into something he had never experienced before, a partnership where both his masculine and feminine qualities could coexist and complement each other. "I've been thinking about something Jung wrote," Marcus said, pulling up a quote on his tablet. He said that the goal of individuation isn't to eliminate the archetypes, but to develop a conscious relationship with them. I think that's what's happened with my connection to Taylor Swift's music. The presentation Marcus was about to give would explore how certain artists become cultural repositories for archetypal projections, and how understanding these patterns could help streaming platforms better serve their users' psychological needs. But more importantly, it represented his own integration of analytical thinking and intuitive understanding, the marriage of his masculine and feminine qualities that Jung called the transcendent function. As the meeting began, Marcus found himself speaking with a fluency and authenticity that surprised even him. "What we're seeing in the data," he explained to the room full of executives, "isn't just consumer preference. It's the activation of archetypal patterns that exist in the collective unconscious. Artists like Taylor Swift become what Jung called cultural complexes. They carry psychological content for millions of people who are seeking integration of disowned aspects of themselves." Jennifer Walsh, the VP of Content Strategy, leaned forward with interest. "Are you saying that people's music choices are driven by unconscious psychological needs?" "Exactly," Marcus replied, feeling the confidence that comes from speaking from integrated understanding rather than theoretical knowledge. When men are drawn to Taylor Swift's music, they're often responding to what Jung called the Anima, the feminine aspect of their psyche that they need to develop. When women connect with her songs about empowerment and self-determination, they're often working with what Jung called the individuation process, the journey toward psychological wholeness. The room was silent, absorbing this perspective that none of them had considered before. Marcus continued, "Understanding these patterns doesn't diminish the artistic value of the music. Instead, it helps us recognize why certain artists have such profound cultural impact. They're not just entertainers. They're serving an archetypal function in the collective psyche." After the presentation, Marcus walked through Central Park, reflecting on how far he had traveled from that initial moment of bewilderment at Taylor Swift's cultural impact. His phone buzzed with a text from Amy. "How did the presentation go?" "Can't wait to hear about it over dinner." The simple message filled him with a warmth that had nothing to do with projection or archetypal fascination. This was the love that came from being seen and accepted as a complete person, shadow and light, masculine and feminine, analytical and intuitive. Amy had witnessed his entire journey of integration, and their relationship had become stronger as he had become more authentically himself. That evening, as they prepared dinner together in their apartment, Marcus found himself moving with a fluidity that incorporated both his natural efficiency and his newly developed capacity for presence. He chopped vegetables with the same precision he brought to data analysis, but he also paused to appreciate the colors and textures, to enjoy the sensory experience of cooking as a creative act. "I've been thinking about something," Amy said as they sat down to eat. "Remember when you first started getting interested in Taylor Swift's music, and I felt like I was competing with some fantasy version of the perfect woman?" Marcus nodded, remembering the tension that had nearly ended their relationship. "I realize now that I was actually competing with parts of yourself that you hadn't integrated yet," Amy continued. "You were projecting your own capacity for emotional depth and creativity onto her because you couldn't access those qualities directly. But now that you've developed them within yourself, you don't need to seek them in external projections." This insight struck Marcus as profoundly accurate. His relationship with Taylor Swift's music had evolved into something entirely different. he could appreciate her artistry without needing it to carry psychological content that belonged to him. The songs that had once felt like messages from his own unconscious now felt like the work of a skilled artist who happened to be particularly gifted at expressing universal human experiences. Jung wrote that the goal of individuation is to become who you really are, Marcus said, reaching across the table to take Amy's hand. I think what happened is that Taylor Swift's music helped me recognize parts of myself that I had disowned. But the real work was learning to integrate those parts into my actual personality and relationships. Later that night, as Marcus listened to Swift's latest album while working on a creative writing project, something he had started as part of his integration process, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. The Anima projection had served its purpose perfectly. It had awakened him to the existence of his own inner feminine, had shown him qualities he needed to develop, and had provided a bridge between his disconnected masculine persona and his emotional depths. But now he could listen to All Too Well or Folklore, without the intense projection that had once characterized his relationship with the music. Instead, he heard the work of a masterful artist who had learned to transform personal experience into universal art, something he was now learning to do in his own small way through his writing and his work. The individuation journey that had begun with archetypal fascination had led him to something far more valuable: the integration of his own psychological wholeness. He no longer needed Taylor Swift to carry his projections because he had learned to carry them himself. The Anima had been internalized, and Marcus had become more fully who he was meant to be. As he closed his laptop and prepared for bed, Marcus felt a deep sense of completion. The journey that had begun with confusion and projection had led him to clarity and integration. He had learned to love a real woman more deeply by first learning to love the feminine aspects of himself. He had discovered his own creativity by first projecting it onto an external artist. He had found his authentic voice by first listening to someone else's. The Anima archetype had done its work, and Marcus was finally fully home. In the end, Carl Jung would indeed have been fascinated by Taylor Swift, not as a celebrity or even as an artist, but as a cultural phenomenon that reveals the deepest patterns of the human psyche. Her unprecedented impact stems not from marketing or talent alone, but from her ability to embody archetypal energies that millions of people need to integrate within themselves. The journey from projection to integration is the path of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who we truly are. Sometimes it takes a pop star to show us the way home to ourselves. In a world that often feels fragmented and disconnected, we search for meaning in the strangest places. Sometimes it takes a pop star's lyrics to awaken us to the depths of our own souls. Sometimes it takes a psychological theory from nearly a century ago to help us understand why we feel so powerfully drawn to certain people, certain songs, certain stories that seem to speak directly to our hearts. Marcus's journey reminds us that our attractions, our obsessions, our deepest longings are never really about the external objects of our desire. They are invitations from our unconscious mind, calling us home to parts of ourselves we have forgotten or never knew existed. The Anima doesn't live in Taylor Swift's music. It lives within each of us, waiting to be discovered, integrated, and expressed in our own unique way. Carl Jung once wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. Perhaps we could add, everything that fascinates us about others can lead us to the discovery of our own hidden potential. The celebrities we idolize, the artists who move us to tears, the public figures who capture our imagination, they are all mirrors reflecting back the archetypal energies we need to develop within ourselves. The path from projection to integration is not easy. It requires the courage to look inward when it would be simpler to remain fascinated by external objects. It demands that we do the difficult work of becoming whole rather than seeking wholeness in others. But this is the path to authentic love, genuine creativity, and lasting fulfillment. Your own journey of individuation is calling to you right now. What projections are you carrying? What parts of yourself are you seeking in others? What would it look like to bring those qualities home to yourself? The anima, or the animus, for our female viewers, is not just a psychological concept. It is a living force within your psyche, waiting to transform your relationships, your creativity, and your understanding of who you truly are. The question is not whether you will encounter these archetypal energies, but whether you will have the wisdom to recognize them and the courage to integrate them. In the end, we are all Marcus, standing at the threshold between projection and wholeness, between fascination and integration, between seeking ourselves in others and finally coming home to who we really are. What did this story awaken in you? Have you ever found yourself inexplicably drawn to a celebrity, artist, or public figure in ways that surprised you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear on their own journey of self-discovery. If this exploration of Jungian psychology and archetypal patterns resonated with you, subscribe to our channel for more stories that illuminate the hidden depths of the human psyche. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a journey into the mysteries of consciousness, meaning, and transformation. Thank you for taking this psychological journey with us. Your willingness to explore these depths is what makes transformation possible.